He gave a voice to the forgotten. He captured the soul of America's working class. He wrote a novel that was banned, burned, and adored in equal measures. He earned a Pulitzer, a Nobel Prize, and the fierce criticism of those who feared what he had to say. His words helped define the Great Depression and the generations that came after it. But behind the timeless books were battles of his own. A complicated personal life, failed marriages, controversy, injuries, political backlash, and a turbulent journey through fame, war, and expectation. This is the Author Files. I'm Kane, and this is the extraordinary, blistering, beautifully human life of John Steinbeck. Okay guys, welcome back to the second episode of the Author Files. Today we're going to be taking a look at the life of the American writer John Steinbeck. But before we jump into the life of John Steinbeck, I want to set the mood a little. When we talk about Steinbeck, we're not just talking about an author, we're stepping into a whole atmosphere. His stories feel dusty, sun-beaten, full of wandering souls and big dreams that don't always go to plan. He wrote about ordinary people with extraordinary honesty, and somehow managed to capture both the grit and the hope of America during some of its toughest years. So, before we dive into the details of his life, his upbringing, and the moments that shaped him, let's take a second to appreciate the world he created. One that was raw, human, and one that is still incredibly powerful today. John was born on the 27th of February 1902 in the farming town of Salinas, California. His father was John Ernst Steinbeck, who wasn't a terribly successful man, but had a few different roles throughout his life. He was known to have been the manager of a Sperry flower plant, the owner of a feed and grain store, and the treasurer of Monterey County. His mother, Olive Hamilton Steinbeck, worked as a teacher and shared John's love for reading and writing. His grandfather was called Johann Adolf Grosch Steinbeck and was the founder of Mount Hope, which was a short-lived farming colony in Palestine that disbanded after Arab attackers killed his brother and assaulted his brother's wife and mother-in-law. He arrived in the United States in 1858 and shortened the family name to Steinbeck. John had a happy childhood. He grew up with two older sisters, Beth and Esther, and then a younger sister called Mary, who he absolutely adored. The Steinbecks were members of the Episcopal Church, although John later became agnostic. He grew up in a small rural valley set in fertile soil about 25 miles from the Pacific coast. Both the coast and the valley would serve as settings for some of his best fiction. John would spend his summers working on nearby ranches, including the Post Ranch in Big Sur. He would go on to labour with migrant workers on Spreckle sugar beet farms. It was here that he learned of the harder aspects of the migrant life and the darker side of human nature, knowledge that would help him later on when he would eventually write Of Mice and Men. While he was working at Spreckle Sugar Company, he would sometimes work in the laboratory, which gave him time to write. It was at the age of 14 that John decided he wanted to be a writer. He spent hours as a teenager living in a world of his own, writing stories and poems in his upstairs bedroom. To please his parents, he enrolled at Stanford University in 1919. To make his time enjoyable, he only signed up for the courses that interested him. These courses were classical and British literature, writing courses, and a smattering of science. At Stanford, the president of the English club said that John, who would regularly attend meetings to read his stories aloud, had no other interests or talents that I could make out. He was a writer, but he was that and nothing else. Writing was definitely John's passion, and between 1919 to 1925, John left Stanford without taking a degree, but would often drop in and out of the university, sometimes to work closely with migrants and bindlestiffs on the Californian ranches. Those relationships, coupled with an early sympathy for the weak and defenseless, deepened his empathy for workers, the disenfranchised, the lonely and dislocated, an empathy that is characteristic in his work. In 1925, after leaving university, John travelled by freighter from Los Angeles to New York City, where he worked as a construction worker and briefly as a journalist for the New York American. Between 1926 and 1928, John had returned back to California and worked as a caretaker in Lake Tahoe. This is where he would meet his first wife, Carol Henning. After meeting, and with money running out due to a slow market, John and Carol moved back to Pacific Grove, California, to a cottage owned by John's father on the Monterey Peninsula, a few blocks outside the Monterey city limits. Older members of his family gave John free rent, paper for his manuscripts, and from 1928, loans that allowed him to write without looking for work. When I read that bit whilst researching, that his family gave him a cottage, gave him paper, and loaned him money to survive whilst he wrote, I was thinking, oh, wouldn't that be lovely? Especially to all us aspiring writers. It would be lovely if we didn't have to work or earn money and we could just, stay in a nice cozy little cottage and write for however long it took us to finish that book that we've all got inside of us. John didn't pass up on this opportunity though, and during those few years, John would go on to write and perfect his first novel, Cup of Gold. Cup of Gold is loosely based on the life and death of Privateer Henry Morgan. It centers on Morgan's assault and sacking of the Panama, which is referred to as Cup of Gold, and on the women, brighter than the sun, who are said to be found there. Cup of Gold would be published in 1929. In 1930, John and Carol married in Los Angeles. Also that year, John met the marine biologist Ed Ricketts, who would become a close and personal friend and mentor to John during the following decade, teaching him a great deal about philosophy and biology. The two would remain very close friends until the end of, spoiler, John's marriage to his first wife, Carol. During this time, John also wrote a werewolf murder mystery titled Murder at Full Moon. However, it has never been published because John considered it unworthy of publication. Between 1930 and 1933, John produced 3 short novels. In 1932, The Pastures of Heaven was released. It consists of 12 interconnected stories about a valley near Monterey, which was discovered by a Spanish corporal while chasing runaway Indian slaves. In 1933, John would release The Red Pony, a 100-page, 4-chapter story which would weave the memories of John's childhood. Also that year, John would release To a God Unknown, which is named after Evedick Kim. It follows the life of a homesteader and his family in California, depicting a character with a primal and pagan worship of the land he works on. Although John had published these stories, he hadn't achieved great success. However, this would all change in 1935 when he wrote Tortilla Flat. The novel was set in a post-war Monterey, California. It portrays the adventures of a group of classless and usually homeless young men in Monterey after World War I and just before the US Prohibition. The novel would go on to win the Commonwealth Club's gold medal. In 1937, John would write a tragic novel called Of Mice and Men. And for me, I would personally argue that it's this novel that he's most famous for in the UK. So when I was at school, which was way over 10 years ago now, when I went to do my GCSEs, we had to read Of Mice and Men as part of the syllabus. And I still remember us all being very, very sad at the ending. And yeah, but it's a very good book. And if you haven't read it, it's quite a short read. It won't take you very long. But yeah, have those tissues at hand. The story is about two traveling ranch workers, George and Lenny, who try to earn enough money to buy their own farm. With the novel being set in 1930s America, it provides a great insight into the Great Depression, encompassing themes of racism, loneliness, prejudice against the mentally ill, and the struggle for personal independence. In August 1936, the San Francisco News asked John to personally interview multiple families in the impoverished Hoovervilles of the San Joaquin Valley. As Steinbeck visited the slums that hug the highways across Central Valley, he was harrowed by what he saw. He talked with multiple families and vowed to make a book depicting their struggles. This would lead to John writing the novel which many would consider as being his greatest work, The Grapes of Wrath. The Grapes of Wrath would achieve John the success he had not yet had. For instance, The Grapes of Wrath was the best-selling book of 1939, and 430,000 copies had been printed by February 1940. Also in February of that year, The Grapes of Wrath won the National Book Award, winning Favourite Fiction Book of 1939. It was voted by members of the American Booksellers Association. Later that year, it won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and would go on to be adapted as a film directed by John Ford. Yes, John achieved great success with The Grapes of Wrath, but there was also backlash. John's political views, along with the negative portrayal of aspects of capitalism and sympathy for the plight of workers, led to backlash against the author for displaying communist views, especially in his hometown of Salinas. John received so many threats that it is said that he purchased a handgun for his own safety. In the year of its publication, the Kern County Board of Supervisors banned The Grapes of Wrath from the county's publicly funded schools and libraries in August 1939, and that ban would last until January 1941. Commenting on this backlash, John wrote, "The vilification of me out here from the large landowners and bankers is pretty bad. The latest is a rumor started by them that the Okies hate me," that's people from Oklahoma, "and have threatened to kill me for lying about them. I'm frightened at the rolling might of this damned thing. It's completely out of hand. I mean, a kind of hysteria about the book is growing that is not healthy." Although John was getting all of this backlash, a pretty high-profile figure at the time decided to comment on The Grapes of Wrath, and that person was the then First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who wrote in her newspaper column, "Now I must tell you that I have just finished a book which is an unforgettable experience in reading. The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck both repels and attracts you. The horrors of the picture, so well drawn, make you dread sometimes to begin the next chapter, and yet you cannot lay the book down or even skip a page." When asked at a later date by a reporter after Eleanor had visited California labor camps if she believed that The Grapes of Wrath was exaggerated, Eleanor responded saying, "I have never believed that The Grapes of Wrath was exaggerated." The next couple of years were tricky for John. World War II would come along, and John and Carol would divorce. When John and Carol first met, and for many years after, many people would say that they were reportedly well suited and had a very symbiotic relationship. Carol was outgoing and inquisitive, whereas John was shy and introspective. John wasn't the only creative in this marriage, though, as Carol was creative in her own right. She had produced whimsical artwork and poetry, but she eventually left her main job to become John's typist, editor, and intellectual partner. Together, they worked and struggled to bring forth John's novels that addressed the social causes that they both had in common. Carol even named The Grapes of Wrath, the book which would achieve John worldwide acclaim. However, once The Grapes of Wrath and John became successes in equal measure, and the goals of both Carol and John had been achieved, their marriage began to suffer. It's reported that a major factor of their marriage breaking down was because of John's affair with the woman who would become his second wife, nightclub singer Gwendolyn Gwyn Conger. To give you the full picture, it seems as though John and Carol had trust issues throughout their marriage. For instance, from details we've learned from a 1932 letter written from John to his sister Mary, it would appear that Carol engaged in a brief affair with Joseph Campbell. He was the author of the landmark work Hero with a Thousand Faces. So, A Hero of a Thousand Faces, I believe, is the blueprint to every hero journey out there. Or I should say, before anybody comes for me, that you could apply Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces to any hero journey out there, like, for example, Star Wars or Harry Potter. So it is said that that's John Campbell, not our John that we're talking about. So John came to Pacific Grove in late winter 1932. It is said that John Campbell and Carol had a short but intense flirtation, which led to a heated confrontation between John and Campbell. And this led to John and Carol being divorced in 1942. In the year of his divorce, John would write The Moon is Down. This is about the Socrates-inspired spirit of resistance in an occupied village in Northern Europe. The novel was made into a film shortly afterwards. In 1943, just a year after his divorce from Carol, John married Gwyn. Together, they would go on to have two sons, Tom Miles Steinbeck, who was born in 1944, and John Steinbeck IV, who was born in 1946. That same year, in 1943, John served as a World War II war correspondent for the New York Herald Tribune and worked with the Office of Strategic Services, who were the predecessors of the CIA. During the war, John accompanied the commando raids of Douglas Fairbanks Jr.'s Beach Jumpers program, which launched small unit diversion operations against German-held islands in the Mediterranean. At one point, John accompanied Fairbanks on an invasion of an island off the coast of Italy and used a Thompson submachine gun to help capture Italian and German prisoners. He collated his writings during this time in a publication called Once There Was a War. Unfortunately, and like so many others, John didn't return from the war unscathed. He had suffered injuries. He had a number of shrapnel wounds and suffered from psychological trauma. However, to treat this, John put his attentions to his writings. In 1944, he wrote the screenplay for Alfred Hitchcock's movie Lifeboat. However, he would later request that his name be removed from the credits of Lifeboat because he believed the final version of the film had racist undertones. Also that year, bruised, battered, and homesick, John would write Cannery Row, which was a love letter to the city of Monterey. In 1947, John's novel The Pearl was released. The story follows a pearl driver, Kino, and explores man's purpose as well as greed, defiance of societal norms, and evil. John's inspiration for this short story turned novel was a Mexican folktale which he had heard in a visit to La Paz in 1940. For the next section of John's life, and especially in the year of 1948, two big events would occur. the end of his second marriage and the death of his friend we mentioned earlier, Ed Ricketts. When we start to look at the end of John's second marriage, we will be going forwards in time and backwards, so please try to keep up. I've tried to script this in the easiest way I could for you all to follow. I only hope I don't get lost. And I'd just also like to say that y in this next section, especially to do with the breakdown of his second marriage, you're going to hear some things about John that paint him in a not great light. And what I am saying is not my opinion. I'm just going by what's factually written out there in the world. And yeah, so I'll let you make your own mind up and interpret what you're about to hear in your own way. So in May 1948, John returned to California on an emergency trip to be with his friend Ed Ricketts, who had been seriously injured when a train had struck his car. However, and very sadly, before John could get to Ed unfortunately passed away. And upon returning home, John was confronted by Gwyn, who had asked him for a divorce. It's said that John would spend the following year in a deep depression. But what happened between Gwyn and John? And why, directly after discovering the death of his friend, did she ask for a divorce? Let's get into it. John and Gwyn divorced by her request in 1948. 3 decades later, as a divorcee in her late 50s, Gwyn would sit down with a show business writer called Douglas Brown in Palm Springs. She gave a series of interviews with Brown, but the interviews remained unpublished. That was until decades later, when they were discovered in a loft in Wales in 2017. After the discovery of these letters, the interviews were then turned into a book written by Bruce Lawson entitled My Life with John Steinbeck. During these interviews, Gwyn paints a picture of how awful it was being married to a writer who she acknowledged as a tremendously complex man. The interviews paint John as being cruel to his wife, particularly during Gwyn's 2 difficult pregnancies. The book also portrays a man of boorish behaviour and bizarre habits. Gwyn says that the only time she ever saw John cry was when his pet rat, who was called Burgess, had died. John was a sadistic man of many emotions, but being sadistic was one of his many qualities, she said, and he would let that rat loose to frighten visitors, especially women. After John and Gwyn's 2 sons were born, the acrimony had become unbearable, ultimately leading to Gwyn's request for divorce. After the marriage had ended, John wrote to a friend saying, "The impulse of the American woman is to geld her husband and castrate her sons. American married life is the doormat to the whorehouse." John would exact his revenge to Gwyn by basing the evil and complex character of Kathy on Gwyn. He would also go on to fight Gwyn in court throughout the next decade to avoid paying child support. But perhaps it was Gwyn who has had the final laugh in their relationship. After all, her interviews were sat for decades just waiting and waiting to be released. And when they were released, they certainly painted a different picture of the highly acclaimed American writer. Also, I should just add that if John did base the character of Kathy in his book East of Eden on Gwen, then I would say that's a very big insult. And if you've read East of Eden, you will know that Kathy, spoiler guys, is the main villain of that book. And the character of Kathy is absolutely... There aren't many words to describe it. To describe her as a character. But what I will say is that she's very, very evil and sadistic and just a pure horror. In 1949, John would meet his third and final wife, stage manager Elaine Scott. The two of them had met in a restaurant in Carmel, California, and by the December of 1950, they were married. In 1952, John would spend 276 consecutive days writing the first draft of what he would consider to be his magnum opus, East of Eden. During this time, he would write daily letters to his editor. Through them, Steinbeck would explore himself, his creative process, his love for writing, and his family life. In East of Eden, John deals with the themes of good and evil. Set in Salinas Valley, the saga follows two families, the Hamiltons, based on John's own maternal ancestry, and the Trasks, reprising stories about the biblical Adam and his progeny. He also includes his paternal ancestry in the story. The book was published in 1952, and portions of it would later be made into a 1955 film starring Hollywood legend James Dean. If you've never read East of Eden, I really recommend it. So, before I'd read East of Eden, the only Steinbeck I'd read is Of Mice and Men, and I'm not really that keen on family sagas, but East of Eden just had me turning every single page, and yeah, I really recommend it. So if you get a chance to pick up a copy, go and pick one up. So we're now going to move on to the later years of John's life, and during this time he would win awards and spend some time living overseas. Growing up, John always had a fascination with the stories of King Arthur. So from March to October 1959, John and Elaine rented a cottage in the hamlet of Discove, Redlinch, which is near Bruton in Somerset, England. From their cottage, John could see the Glastonbury Tor, and nearby he would visit Cadbury Castle, which was the supposed site of King Arthur's court of Camelot. These were vital places for John to visit while collating research for his retelling of the Arthurian legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. The product of this research, which John would title The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights, would not be published until after his death in 1976. However, John and Elaine would always recall that their time spent in this cottage in England was the happiest time of their life together. In 1961, John would release his final novel, The Winter of Our Discontent, which examines moral decline in the United States. The protagonist of the novel, Ethan, grows discontented with his own moral decline and that of those around him. The book was received as having a very different tone to the rest of his works, and it was not a critical success, with many being disappointed that he hadn't released a novel which was up to the standards of The Grapes of Wrath. For his realistic and imaginative writing, combining as it does sympathetic humour and the keen social perception, John won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1962. The decision to award John with the Nobel Peace Prize was heavily criticised. A Swedish newspaper even went so far as to declare the decision one of the Academy's biggest mistakes. American literary critics were also harsh. The New York Times asked why the Nobel Committee gave the award to an author whose limited talent is, in his best books, watered down by tenth-rate philosophizing, adding that the international character of the award and the weight attached to it raised questions about the mechanics of selection and how close the Nobel Committee is to the main currents of American writing. We think it is interesting that the Laureate was not awarded to a writer whose significance, influence, and sheer body of work had already made a more profound impression on the literature of our age. On the day John was announced as being the winner, he was asked if he thought he deserved the Nobel, with John replying, frankly, no. However, John still went to Stockholm to accept the award. He gave a speech and said, "The writer is delegated to declare, to celebrate man's proven capacity for greatness of heart and spirit, for gallantry and defeat, for courage, compassion, and love. In the endless war against weakness and despair, These are the bright rally flags of hope and emulation. I hold that a writer who does not believe in the perfectibility of man has no dedication nor any member in literature. In 2012, the Nobel Peace Prize unlocked its archives, which gave an insight into why they chose John as the deserving winner in 1962. And unfortunately, it appears that the archives revealed that the committee had chosen John that year because he was the best of a bad lot. Other writers considered that year included Robert Graves, Lawrence Durrell, and Karen Blixen. Some writings from the committee member Henry Olson were also revealed in the archives, with Henry saying, "There aren't any obvious candidates for the Nobel Prize, and prize committee is an unenviable situation." Although many of the committee believed that John's best work was behind him, committee member Anders Osterling believed that the release of his final novel, The Winter of Our Discontent, showed that after some signs of slowing down in recent years, John has regained his position as a social truth-teller and is an authentic realist fully equal to his predecessors, Sinclair Lewis and Ernest Hemingway. At a press conference for the Nobel Peace Prize, John was asked about his favourite authors and said Hemingway's short stories and nearly everything Faulkner wrote. Also that year, John would release a travelogue of his 1960 road trip with his poodle, Charlie. In the book, John writes about his lost youth and his roots, while dispensing both criticism and praise for the United States. John's son Tom would later say that his father made the journey because he knew he was dying and wanted to see the country one last time. In September of 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson awarded John the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In the February of 1966, John and Elaine traveled to Israel, where they met officials including Teddy Kollek. Whilst there, they visited Tel Aviv, which was the site of Mount Hope, which, as mentioned at the start of this episode, was the farm community established by his grandfather, whose brother Friedrich Gross Steinbeck had been murdered by Arab marauders in 1858 during the outrages at Jaffa. A year later, on the request of Newsday magazine, John travelled to Vietnam to report on the war. His thoughts on the Vietnam War were that it was a heroic venture. His sons served in Vietnam, and John visited one of them on the battlefield. It is reported that at one point, John was allowed to man a machine gun watch position at night at a fire base while his son and other members of the platoon slept. In 1968, at the age of 66, John died of heart disease and congestive heart failure in New York City during the 1968 flu pandemic. It is reported that John was a lifelong smoker, and the later autopsy would show a complete occlusion of the main coronary arteries. John wished to have his body cremated, and this was done on March 4th, 1969. He would also be interred at the Hamilton family gravesite in Salinas, with those of his parents and maternal grandparents. Before his death, John had told his doctor that he felt deeply in his flesh that he would not survive the physical death, and that the biological end of his life was the final end to it. His third wife, Elaine, would die in 2004 and was buried in the same plot. So, now that we've unravelled the main heft of John's life, let's look at some other interesting moments and some facts you may or may not know about the American author. It is known that John struggled with learning how to read. When he was younger, he would call books printed demons and would liken them to thumbscrews. And he would remain thinking this way until the age of 9, when his aunt gifted him a simplified version of Le Morte d'Arthur, The Legends of King Arthur and His Round Table. It was through this fascination with the Arthurian legends that shone a new light and opened up the world of books and reading for him. By the way, I apologize. I probably just butchered that title, but it is what it is, and we're going to move on. So, throughout John's life, he would be prone to freak accidents and illnesses. When he was a teenager, he contracted I can't say that word, pleural pneumonia, and nearly died. When he briefly lived in New York City, John's balcony roof fell off with him standing on it. Later on in life, when traveling back from Asia, he ruptured a spinal disc by lifting a case of beer and later needed intensive spinal surgery as a result. John would also suffer a stroke, a heart attack, and a detached retina during his lifetime. John wasn't always loved by Salinas residents. During his lifetime, his hometown staged at least 2 public burnings of his books, particularly The Grapes of Wrath. It's reported that on one occasion, a group of Salinas residents burned copies of the books outside the old library, and at another time, a local church member hosted a Steinbeck book burning event. Speaking of this, John said, "No town celebrates a writer before he's dead. It just isn't done." Today, though, if you were to visit Salinas, you couldn't move for the name Steinbeck. There are various sites to visit, and many buildings seem to bear his name, from the high school to the local businesses on the highway. In 2012, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, released documents which indicated that John had offered his services to the agency in 1952, whilst planning a European tour. Walter Bedell Smith, the director of the Central Intelligence at the time, was eager to take him up on the offer. If John had performed any work for the CIA during the Cold War, we do not know about it, which means that if his offer was accepted, whatever information John may or may not have given to the CIA is currently unknown. What is known, and thanks to documents released by the Security Service of Ukraine in 2014, these indicate that the Soviet KGB suspected John of being an American agent when he visited locations within the USSR, including Kiev in 1947. An early draft of John's novel of Mice and Men was eaten by his dog. We've all heard the excuse, "My homework was eaten by the dog," and nobody ever believes it. But it truly did happen with one of John's early drafts. The culprit was his dog Max, one of several dogs that John would own throughout his lifetime. In the 1980s, rumours started emerging that John's most popular novel, The Grapes of Wrath, had been translated into Japanese as The Angry Raisins. To write East of Eden, John reportedly used 300 pencils. He was known to use up to 60 pencils in a day, preferring pencil to typewriter or a pen. John was also right at hand when his son wanted love advice. In 1958, he wrote a letter to his son Tom after he had written to his father for advice because he had fallen desperately in love with a girl named Susan. Steinbeck would write to his son saying, "The object of love is the best and most beautiful. Try to live up to it." He would end the letter by assuring his son, "And don't worry about losing. If it is right, it happens. The main thing is not to hurry. Nothing good ever gets away." So, now that we've listened and discovered some facts about John, I think it's time that we sum up and conclude his life. So, John didn't simply write about humanity. He lived inside it, uneasily, fiercely, sometimes painfully, but always with that relentless curiosity for what makes people break and what makes them endure. His journey began in the quiet, fertile valley of Salinas, where a shy boy wandered between ranches and beet fields, listening, observing, storing away stories the world didn't yet know it needed. Those early encounters with migrant laborers, drifters, bindle stiffs, and the forgotten souls didn't just inspire him, they formed him. They taught him that the margins of society were often the most honest places to look for truth, And it was precisely from the margins that Steinbeck would build his legacy. But greatness, as we've seen, doesn't come neatly packaged. Behind every novel, behind every success, was a man grappling with more than most of his readers ever realised. John was brilliant but difficult, sensitive but combative, a man capable of great empathy on the page and great stubbornness at home. His friendships shaped him, his losses scarred him, and his marriages revealed the complicated, often uneven weight of being bound to someone whose world revolved around the written word. His first wife, Carol, helped birth his early books and even named the one that would change everything, The Grapes of Wrath. And when that book exploded into the world, when it was praised and banned and burned and adored, John found himself thrust into a national conversation he hadn't asked for but could never escape. Fame magnified his power, but it also magnified his anxiety, his insecurities, and the fractures in his marriage. As success arrived, stability vanished. His second marriage to Gwyn was turbulent, marked by love, resentment, passion, and pain. Her later recollections paint a portrait of a man who was brilliant but blunt, creative but deeply flawed. A reminder that great writers are rarely great husbands. John used life as a fuel for fiction, and in the aftermath of their divorce, even his anger became literature, shaping one of his most haunting characters. And yet, even when life was at its most chaotic, John kept writing, because writing wasn't a profession for him. It was the way he stayed alive. He found steadiness at last with Elaine, a partnership that gave him comfort in the years when his health declined and his fame, once electrifying, became a weight. But even in those later decades, John wasn't done searching. He travelled the world. He visited the landscapes of King Arthur. He drove across America with his dog, trying to reconnect with the fading vision of a country he loved and feared was slipping away. He involved himself in politics, war, and controversy. He earned a Nobel Prize he didn't believe he deserved. And through it all, he kept returning to the same questions. What makes us human? What breaks us? And what, in the end, saves us? John's life wasn't neat. It wasn't polished. It certainly wasn't perfect. But it was honest. It was raw. And it was lived with an intensity that bled into every sentence he wrote. Today, when we read his work, whether it's the tragedy of Lenny and George, the dust-covered odyssey of the Jets, the aching moral conflict of Ethan Hawley, or the sprawling biblical saga of East of Eden, we're not just reading stories. We're reading places of John's soul, the compassion he had for the downtrodden, the rage he held towards injustice, the guilt he carried, the flaws he couldn't outrun, and the hope he refused to abandon. Because at the centre of John's writing is a belief he never surrendered, that even in the bleakest of circumstances, there is a spark within people worth fighting for. He knew intimately and humanity could be cruel, hysterical, selfish, and afraid. But he also believed that humanity could be heroic, gentle, brave, and loving. And he believed that literature, at its best, didn't just reflect life, it challenged it. John died in 1968, convinced that the end of the body meant the end of everything. No afterlife, no continuation, just the closing of a chapter. And yet, ironically, the very man who doubted his own permanence has become one of America's most enduring storytellers. Today, the valley he loved bears his name everywhere you look. His book remains staples in classrooms. His characters continue to breathe in the minds of the new generations, and his voice, sharp, compassionate, and unrelenting, still echoes through the long corridors of American literature. John Steinbeck wanted to understand the human heart, and maybe that's why he still matters, because he didn't just write about who we are, he wrote about who we could be. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of today's deep dive into the life of John Steinbeck. From the Salinas Valley to the Nobel Prize stage, his journey was anything but simple, but his writing continues to capture that raw, restless human spirit in a way few authors ever have. I hope this episode has given you a fresh appreciation for the man behind Of Mice and Men, The Grapes of Wrath, and the countless characters who still feel so real even decades later. Thank you so much for listening and spending this time with me. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow the show, leave a review, or share it with another book lover. It genuinely helps this new podcast to grow. And if you missed the first episode, please go back and take a listen. It's on the wonderful life of Dame Agatha Christie. Next time, we're going to be switching the gears completely and diving into the magical, mischievous world of beloved children's author Enid Blyton. From the famous Five to the faraway Tree, and let's not forget about Noddy. Her story shaped millions of childhoods, but her life behind the scenes is just as fascinating, and I can't wait for you guys to hear this one. So until then, take care, keep reading, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye guys.